Hey, welcome to Unity Now, a podcast about where we discuss all things Unity 2020. Today is our first episode, and I'm really excited to bring you a great panel of volunteers and individuals from the Unity movement. So let's just jump into it. Today we have a great panel, 5 other individuals, Toby, Allison, William, Terri, and George. And today we're really going to be kind of having a conversation about where did you guys all come from politically and just in your lives? How did you kind of find the Unity movement? What motivates you and what inspires you about the movement, and where do you kind of want to see it going? And so over the next 40 or 50 minutes, we're going to kind of have a nice conversation about that. So first, I want to start with Toby. Toby, I'd love to kind of hear your background, where you came from, your political background, and what moment did you realize the political system, as it exists, is just not right for you?
It started for me really a couple of years after the 2016 election. Growing up in rural Indiana, politics wasn't really discussed in my house or in my community growing up. So I really didn't get into the political landscape, thinking about it, talking about it, until probably my late 20s, early 30s, when by that time, the folks that surrounded me, whether it was in my family or the people I worked with, friends, really became sort of a Republican echo chamber, which is easy to do in a state like Indiana, which is mostly conservative and Republican. And then the mission became, to elect Donald Trump to defeat Hillary, right? And I became part of that kind of group think to where I was in Team Republican, and really, if for nothing else than to defeat the other team, is why we had to vote for one person. And after the 2016 election and the following 2 years is when I really started to kind of by accident discover people like Simon Sinek and Jordan Peterson and Brett and Eric Weinstein and the rest of the intellectual dark web. And I really started to think, see what true, honest conversations about polarizing topics looked like. And that made me start to look at how I viewed those same topics and same events going on in the country. And had I really given, my own beliefs and my look into politics, an honest view. And that's when I started to kind of extract myself from that groupthink of being on Team Republican and started to think for myself. And that's when, that led me to the last couple of years and into 2020, seeing where the country is now and how it's so divided and so polarized, where you have, one group that is willing to do anything they can to defeat this person and the other group the same. I think it's so important that every individual look at what they truly believe in. And even if they believe in one candidate's goals for the country, what they say, their goals are, everyone look at this movement and what it can do for the country to calm down the polarization and really help everyone think for themselves and think what would be best for the country, and who go about that with honest conversations with anybody they might disagree with.
It's interesting because I know we did a whole poll of all the volunteers, and I think so far we have almost 1,500 volunteers in some capacity or another working on the Unity movement. And what was so interesting, and I think really is kind of like the hallmark of the Unity movement, is that there is such a degree of diversity. And even on this call, as we'll soon see, we're all over the political scene. I'm wondering, I'm a fellow, Republican. I, registered. I did not vote, however, for Trump, and it was my first election, so I was a little disappointed. And I noticed and I'd love to know, Toby, and also I think some other people here, I'd love to kind of know your thoughts on, did you feel that the Republican Party in 2015 and 2016 kind of died as a party and became more kind of like, all right, this is kind of a party rallying around one person, and a lot of those other interesting Republican values just kind of went out the window?
I think to some degree it did. And, it became more about, again, like I said, I'm in this group. I want to do nothing else but defeat the other group. Yeah. And so, the true beliefs kind of went out the window in some regards. And because if you truly aligned, your beliefs with the party, you wouldn't always come out with supporting one candidate versus the other. But a lot of people still ended up voting for that candidate, again, just to defeat the other side or defeat, the lesser of two evils, which I think is still the danger we're in 2020.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so we're gonna move it over to Terri. So Terri, I know we've had a few conversations over the last week, and I know you kind of come from a slightly different background. So I'd love to kind of hear your journey to this point.
I think for me, it started in about 2003. I had been in the military, in the Air Force, for 5 years prior to that. And so my whole world was surrounded by people who were at the time, this was like 9/11, Iraq War. People were very pro-war, pro-George W. Bush. So I thought they were all idiots. And I was very, kind of a liberal that just thought I was smarter than everyone else. And then right after that, when I got out, I used my GI Bill and I went to art school. And so I went straight from the military to art school. And then so now I'm in college with all these art school students. And I was like, oh God. I just realized that this is not necessarily the better option. They're not smarter. They're just, these are two sides of the same coin. So then I kind of became disillusioned with both parties. And I thought, well, I'm very suspicious. I don't even believe anything anyone says. But I still maintain this, at least, facade that I was a liberal because it was easier in my social circle to just kind of be like, yeah, I'm a liberal, sure, whatever. But then Trump got elected and I saw my circle of friends and, just people that I really respected kind of lose their rationality and become very narrow-minded and vicious against people who disagree with them. And when Me Too happened, that was the real point in time that I was like, I'm done. I don't want to be associated with this. I saw people use something that started out being good as a weapon to destroy people. And it just became really clear to me that there were some really dark implications of this ideology. And so now I'm seeing it all happen again, but even bigger. And I'm just I'm tired of pretending that I believe this one thing just to appease friends, because now I see that they're not just these kind of ideological dreamers, that there's a real vicious intent.
I'm curious, and I think what you're describing is so poignant, and I actually would love next to talk to Will, because I know, Will, you're a college student, and I just graduated from university, and I always knew that personally, when I said I'm a registered Republican, but I definitely am not your traditional Republican in the sense that I have a lot of liberal values and also a lot of conservative values. But I always remember in political conversations with a lot of people, it was just kind of assumed that you stood at the same point that everyone else did. And I think there was nothing, at least for me, I never felt like I was really being stifled. It just was like I probably shouldn't maybe bring up a counterpoint. And I'm just gonna kind of let it slide. So it sounds to me like when you kind of in your social circles, though, it could get kind of vicious. And I would love to kind of, if you could maybe shed light on that through maybe an example. We can obviously keep it generalized, but I'd love to kind of hear a slight example about that vicious kind of cycle.
From me?
Yes, Terri, yeah.
So specifically when the Me Too movement was in full swing in late 2017, I was involved in, I am a little scared to say it, but I was involved in, I lived in Southern California at the time, and I was involved in improv comedy, and they were this very ideological group, even though it's silly improv, but I saw one of my friends, my best friend, kind of get mobbed within a Facebook group, and it wasn't fair. He wasn't deserving of it, but the fervor of the moment made some people really mad, and then the rest of the people too afraid to say anything. And basically his whole life was ruined in the span of an hour because of this Facebook mob. And, these were people who were our friends, who were participating in it. And it's almost like they lost their humanity. And when I would say like, hey, don't you, like, he's suffering right now, do you not care about that? And people thought it was funny. Like they were laughing at him, and they did not care that he lost, like I don't want to get too specific,
Yeah,
but
we don't want to,
but he lost basically his ability to make money, and he lost his entire social and professional circle, and they didn't care. And I was just like, well, this can't be the side of good. This is now being used as this blunt weapon just to hurt someone in the name of being morally righteous. And I can just see that this moral righteousness, it really preys on the things that people care about, which are women and racism. And like, we really care about those things, and we really want to be good people. And so it was just, it was very, very, very vicious and frightening.
I actually have I just realized I have an interesting comparison.
go for it.
Between what you were just saying. Okay, so we know that the death penalty has been trotted out as this thing that it's, okay, so if we have the death penalty, it's like a deterrent for crime. But a lot of people on the left will say, well, it's actually, by the numbers, it doesn't work that well as a deterrent, right? However, in this case, what they will also say is public shaming in this form, like where this man's life gets completely ruined, is a deterrent to other men who might do the same thing. Well, is that really the case, that it's actually working as a deterrent, or are we destroying one man's life as a scapegoat and it's not actually solving what the root problem is, which is maybe in some instances men do have this problem where they might be more aggressive. We do know that the statistics show that men are more likely to be jailed and stuff and be more violent. Is it actually working as a deterrent like they say that it is? Or is it more like what I just compared to the death penalty, where it's like, we say that it's a deterrent, but that's not actually what we actually see all the time.
It seems, sorry.
With Terri, and then we'll go with Will. I want
Cool.
Terri to respond to that.
Yeah, just really quick to end this point, but if anyone says that it's a deterrent, I'm just not sure that I buy that, because it seems not in the service of actually fixing anything, because there's no redemption. It's more of a power play, to be honest, is what it seems like.
That's exactly why I was thinking of comparing it to the death penalty, because I mean, this is such an extreme power thing where you think, okay, this is getting justice, but I think the end goal of any of these movements should be creating better people, like having redemption. Like ultimately we should be working towards that, just creating, having redemption, showing that, people can do better and change and forgiveness.
Yeah, absolutely. Will, did you want first Allison, because we definitely kind of skipped through. Can you just give kind of like a 30-second about you, and then we'll jump to Will and about him, and kind of from there.
Oh, anything specific, like how I?
Yeah, just kind of, if you were to give kind of like, like the classic elevator pitch of kind of where you come from politically and that journey that led you to where you are here.
Yeah, so I grew up in a very liberal family. Both my parents have been lifelong Democrats, and both my grandparents, as far as I know. And but both sides of my family are very science oriented. My dad worked in construction, and my mom was a computer programmer, and so I was always in that sphere of facts matter. And But I think what changed my perspective is several years ago, I listened to Jonathan Haidt's TED Talk about the moral landscape. And so I really started to think, okay, so like we as liberals and conservatives, the major difference we have is that we put more weight on specific values. And I think that's a really good thing because, ultimately we need to have these two sides who are in slight opposition so that we can come to a center that is reasonable and it's thought out. And so I've started to really see that having both sides of the aisle, people on both sides is important and valuable, which is why I really value diversity. And I went to a very conservative school, and I also went to an extremely liberal school. Like when I was at UCLA, first talk, we do diversity training, everybody asked their pronouns, and it was so strange for me because I had also gone to a Catholic undergrad, which was like completely the opposite. I was one of the most liberal people on campus. And so just seeing those two divides, I was like, it's important that I was exposed to both of these. And that's what I want to like tell everybody on both sides that thinks that the other side is crazy, is it's not that the other side is crazy, it's that they see a part of the world that you're not necessarily seeing the same way, and putting more value on that. And I think that's why I really came to Unity, because I think one of the most important parts of this project is bridging the gap between the liberals and conservative side, because it's so important that we figure out how to work together again.
Absolutely. I'm 100%. I think probably we are all in agreement of that. And I think you said it really well, where it's like each side sees the world just a little bit differently. And that doesn't necessarily mean that's invalid. It's just a different perspective on the same world, right? And if we can kind of figure out a way to bring that together, I mean, look, there's plenty of points on the conservative and on the liberal side that make excellent points. And in their own different ways could be really correct. And why should we sit on one side and not listen to anything else on the other side at all, right? You're wasting like an entire perspective, and it's almost not productive, right? Will, so being a college student, I think in the university structure, I know a lot of people in the media love to just rip and hate on universities. And I think a lot of it's kind of a lot of hype because, I don't think anyone out there, at least from my experience, I'd love to hear your thoughts. I don't think a lot of these students are out there trying to be really sinister. I think they're just really trying to help build a world they think is correct, right? And they think will actually help and be inclusive to people. And I don't think that's really fundamentally wrong. Maybe it's just kind of in the approach, as Terri has put it, and in the way that they've kind of become really almost kind of militaristic in that approach. So, Will, I'd love to kind of hear a little bit about you and your experience in university.
Sure, yeah. Just quick before I go into that, I want to say something about the issue of deterrence we were talking about before. I was watching this podcast, I think it was a podcast Coleman Hughes did with Steven Pinker, and they were talking about like criminal penalties. And I guess what the evidence tends to show is that the severity of the penalty has a much smaller effect than the likelihood that that penalty is actually handed out. So a lot of the issues with death penalty deterrence, why it's not effective, is because even though it's a very high penalty, it doesn't happen very often. Whereas something like, social ostracization for having slightly controversial views is very likely to happen. So it probably has a bigger deterrent effect. So that's something that might be relevant when talking about these issues. So then to the kind of campus side of that, what my experience has been, and I'm at a school that is kind of uniquely left-wing, and it doesn't help that it's really small, because when you have like 2,000 students, and let's say even like 2/3 of them kind of fall on one side of the spectrum, the ones that don't are very small in number, so it's a lot harder for them to find each other. So my brother, he's at Harvard, and he feels that the situation even there, even though the political breakdown is fairly similar, he has very easily found people who are like-minded, not even necessarily like-minded, but who are open to people who aren't necessarily like-minded. But I think a lot of that comes down to like what the absolute numbers are rather than like a ratio breakdown. So what school did you go to, Nick?
So I went to RPI.
Okay, yeah. So I would assume that probably has a different kind of dynamic going on than somewhere like Amherst does, when it's just so small in an area that's pretty far left, and then with a particularly politically active student body, where everyone is in some way involved in some classes that have a kind of political bent to them. So my experience has generally been fine. Like, I found a group of people who could put up with things I'd say, and they understood who I was, and they aren't uncomfortable when I kind of push back on some of the things that they say that I think are a little iffy. But one thing that really shocked me was, I think it was about a year and a half ago, there's this guy I was pretty good friends with for the past like 2 semesters. And every now and then he would say like kind of wackier progressive things. He was a Black Studies major and, pretty politically active. But I would make kind of little, snarky remarks at things he would say. And it never seemed like that made him uncomfortable. Like he seemed to be fine with it. And then I realized that he thought I was totally joking when I would say those things, that I was like parodying someone who was less left-wing, and didn't understand that I actually had different opinions than him. So then once we were talking about, I don't even remember what, one of my friends referenced me being like pretty libertarian, and he turned to me and was like, wait, what? You are like a Republican? I was like, no, but also, is that a problem? And then for the next 2 hours, he grilled me on every issue he could think of to, in his own words, determine that I was a good person. And after that, I just realized how kind of perverse the attitude a lot of my fellow students have about what it means to have differing opinions. And, most of them are, in every other sense, normal, well-adjusted people, but they've been so heavily propagandized that they really don't know what to do when they come into contact with someone who's honest about what they think and disagrees with them. And it was one thing that was really weird in that interaction was there are a couple issues where he was, interrogating me on, and my answer was, I don't really know enough about that to have a firm stance. And he just would not accept that as an answer. He's like, well, no, I mean, that's such a cop-out. Like, you must have an opinion. I was like, no, I mean, I'm not going to say that I'm certain about something that I don't know much about. And so even that, like the idea of just being willing to admit ignorance on something is not accepted as a valid answer to a lot of people, which I don't understand, because I feel like if someone says that to me, it's such a clear sign that this is not someone who's trying to grandstand. This isn't someone who's trying to, blindly push an ideology. It's just someone who's, engaging with specific issues, in a thoughtful way. But this guy just could not contemplate the fact that I would both disagree with him and also not have definitive answers for all of his questions.
I think what's so fascinating is like one of the things I learned coming out of university, and I think it's just an important life skill, is realizing the world is far more complicated than you're ever going to be able to understand, right? Like, it's just impossible. You're never going to be able to get all of it. There's no such thing fundamentally as maybe a right answer, sometimes multiple right answers, and there's multiple wrong answers. But this type of ideology, in order to like structure it and package it into like tweet size comments, right, requires you to have an opinion on everything, even when honestly that's impossible, right? And it requires, like, I think the idea, and I'm not, these are not like novel ideas. I think a lot of people complain. I think a lot of us probably agree that there's a lack of nuance out there because you're not really allowed to say, I just don't know. And that's it. Everyone's like, well, what do you mean you just don't know? What you have to, like, this, and they just kind of go at you. And again, I think it's personally, I'd love to hear everyone's thoughts on this, but I think it does come from a good place, because if you are framed up where you're like, oh, conservatives are fundamentally anti-LGBT, for example, right? Or they're just fundamentally fascist, you would naturally want to fight someone and or disagree with someone and argue with someone that might hold really extreme values, right? Like if you came across an actual neo-Nazi, you wouldn't sit there and be like, oh, well, whatever, no big deal. But the problem is most people are not neo-Nazis. Most people are not Stalinists, right? Most people, most Americans are regular, run-of-the-mill individuals that just want to have a nice life, want to have a job, a good opportunity, and not get crazy. But these words have been so diluted, right? Where it's so easy to just call someone a Nazi or call someone a communist, that everyone appears like that now. And so I love to kind of hear everyone's thoughts about this issue of dilution, and whether or not maybe that's kind of helped you come to realize that we now more than ever need to build a stronger center that can integrate actual values together.
Yeah, so for me, I remember like a couple years ago back when Donald Trump was running for president, I first read about a unity ticket, and that's what caught my attention. And I've kind of latched onto that idea as like the last hope for us, because I think that to get anything done, you'd have to get both sides of the aisle because of the filibuster in the Senate and the majority required in Congress. And there's certain facets to our republic that would require a popular consensus rather than the forced consensus that we have now with partisan politics.
George, that was a great point. Can you introduce yourself to the audience?
Yes, so I'm George Brown, and I'm going to be a student in college this upcoming year, and I'm also an intern at a tech company. And I've been working with social media with the campaign and the email copywriting. So, yeah.
That's awesome. And I think you bring up a great point where it's like now more than ever, even when it comes to like practical matters of like getting law and policies through, trying to come together and have this degree of compromise is really important. And I think I've heard a lot of people, just rail like bipartisanism, right? The idea of working together, because you can't work with the other side because, well, they're fascists or they're communists. So a question I'd love to have, to the group, I'd love to send out to you guys is, how can we as volunteers of unity, how can we as individuals that have come to this realization together from all different walks of life, whether liberal, conservative, how can we go back into our own circles, whether it's a deep red state, a liberal campus, a liberal city? How can we go back to our social circles and try to promote and spread this message? Let's start with Toby, because Toby, I know you're in a deep red state, and I'd love to kind of hear your thoughts on this.
Yeah, I think from what I've been doing, basically, it's trying to be honest about what's going on. And, one question that I've thought to pose is, would you rather elect somebody like Admiral McRaven, if, let's say for an instance that he's the center-right person on this ticket, would you rather elect him or Joe Biden? That's something I might pose to my friends and family, because I think the danger here is that, like I said before, even if you staunchly agree with, say, Donald Trump and his politics and what he says he believes in, and you believe he's honest in those endeavors, I don't know if we haven't gotten past that point already. I don't know if the country will survive one of these two being elected and the polarizing effect it will have. But, even if to the folks that, don't truly believe in those, I think that's the danger, what you were talking about, of this group identity sort of politics, where we can easily fit somebody into this nice, neat little box, and then we don't really have to listen to their individual ideas. We can just dismiss them in whatever group they belong to, because it's not ours. It's not any group that we believe in, and we know that we can mark them as evil or whatever it may be. And so that's kind of the message I've been giving to my friends and family. Here's something you really need to pay attention to, because, I have friends that are already sort of preparing for worst case scenario in November, and, have a meeting place designated after the election. And, there are people, I don't know if they would vote for Donald Trump being in a red state, or even Joe Biden. I'm not sure, but I know they fear what's happening. And that's, it's one of those things where people think that an individual can't make a difference, but it's not true. there's a reason Brett Weinstein introduced this idea on Joe Rogan's podcast. And there's a reason that the first volunteer came and the second volunteer, and all of us are here together now as individuals, and we can, all of us truly make a difference here.
Yeah. I think with that, Terri?
Sorry about that. Well, I kind of, to get back to the point of neutrality and what William was saying about how he couldn't, his friend was wanting him to take a side. I'm not sure that we can really speak to the loudest people on the fringes. They may have made up their mind, but I think that what we have here is a lot of people like us who really, really aren't on board with it, but they're just, they call it the silent majority, but they're either too afraid or just not wanting to bother with it. But there are a lot of people who do not want that, like, polarizing, this side is evil or this side is evil. They really want something sane. And I think that just by the fact that we're, speaking up, just more, I think what we need to do to answer your question about going back into our social circles is that stop being afraid to give your opinion just because you fear being ostracized, because the more people who give their opinion, the less powerful that really is, because all that is it is a deterrent to not speak up. So just keep speaking up and just, accept that some people are going to call you names or think that you're a fascist or whatever it is, but there's going to be a lot of people who hear that and say, oh, well, that's what I think too.
I think that's a great point. I think there's definitely far more, I think it kind of goes back to the initial point where there's far more people out there than this tiny majority of people talking. I think probably all of us, if I had to guess, are on some sort of social media platform. And if you spend any time like on Twitter or something like that, it seems like everybody, right, is a hyper partisan. But it's important also to remember that, like, Twitter or Facebook, that's not really the real world, right? There's plenty of people out there.
Right.
Like my dad, he does not have any social media at all, right? So he doesn't even get anywhere close to that type of discourse. And I think it's important to remember, like, there are plenty of people out there. And if we can get our message, we're going to get shot down by some people, but that's not the real target market, right? It's the individuals that are like, you know what? Maybe I don't agree with 100% of what you're saying, but I hear you. And I think you're making better points than the ideologue over here that's just blasting out, really vicious stuff.
Yeah, and to that point, I would say that there's like movements for like settle for Biden or Republicans against Trump, and I think that they're trying to be a loud voice, but they're also like there's all these sort of interest in politics, and that we have to get a people-led movement instead of like a corporate movement. Not saying it's bad with companies or anything, but like yeah.
That's an interesting point about the corporate. I was just going to say that it's interesting that all the corporations are sort of taking a side, and a lot of people, who are way far out of college are now going through this whole thing in their career where they're being forced to agree with an ideology. And so I think, again, this is a perfect moment to speak to those people who are like, whoa, that's not how I think. Sorry, go ahead.
Allison, go for it. I think.
Oh, yeah. So I think one of the biggest problems we have with the divide is it's kind of an all or nothing approach. If you sign up for the Democrats or you sign up for the Republicans, you're signing on to every single policy on their page versus the exact opposite on the other page. So like climate change, it's completely opposite. Abortion is completely opposite, right? Where our democracy is supposed to work, where you get a coalition around one issue, and you can get a majority of people engaged around that one issue, and then that one issue becomes law, right? So you can get liberals and conservatives together on the same issue. So it doesn't matter if you say you're conservative and then you're automatically pigeonholed into this one little box, right? You can go issue by issue and figure out a solution to that. And I think one of the things that I keep wanting to tell liberals is that, do we want to look like we're bringing about change, or do we actually want that to happen? Because if you vote for this one party approach where it's, you know, you're taking the whole bubble of issues, right, and you cut yourself off from ever working with any Republicans, you're not going to be able to pass any one issue, because you have to have moderates and conservatives on your side in order to get any one issue passed that you want to get passed. And so taking this all or nothing approach ultimately will lead to every single policy that you want passed failing, because obviously the conservatives aren't going to sign on to this all or nothing approach, right? It doesn't make any sense to try to push it that way. And so that's what I want to say all the time is, I don't want to like virtue signal that I'm a good person. I want there to be actual change, which is why we have to work with the moderates and conservatives.
Yeah, Allison, speaking to that point, I'd say that the partisanship of the politics that we now live in, of where each side keeps going at it and they keep going like further and further to each side of the spectrum, is actually tearing at our social fabrics of like who we are and who we are as a people. Because we used to be people who didn't have political parties. That's how our founding fathers founded the country. And now look at us. We're separating and we're dividing each other instead of coming together.
I have a question for the group. Do you feel like, I mean, the parties that we have right now are driven by pretty fervent ideologies, right? You know, the right has been taken over by this Trumpian ideology. The left has definitely been the emergence of this progressive ideology. Do you guys feel like ideology is an inevitable consequence of the system? Or is it possible to kind of create this anti-ideology, right? Where it's like, you know what, I care maybe about a few major things, but I'm willing to have this degree of compromise. Because I think what happens a lot of the time, and I think Allison gave a great point in the form of climate change, is where you have people that are like, look, the world's going to end in 10 years. We do not have time to compromise with oil companies to, you know, improve our natural gas to help us kind of like move off of oil and coal. So we have to be as fervent as possible to get solar, wind, and other things going. So how can you take a step back and try and form that anti-ideology? And also, do you think ideology is inevitable? Do you think this division is just an inevitable progression of the system we live in?
I think part of the issue with kind of the way ideology tends to play out within our political parties is not so much the fact that it is ideological, but that it's in a lot of ways dishonestly ideological, where they're using a sort of simplified abstraction of an ideology in order to push policies that would only be supported if you had an incomplete understanding of what it is. So, you know, with like climate change, for instance, the kind of pseudo-libertarian-esque stance that is taken by the Republican Party is, oh, well, we shouldn't be over-regulating industry. We should let them be able to, you know, do what they choose to do. But it's ignoring a very kind of libertarian argument that if you're, you know, causing harm to other people's property in the course of your actions, then that's not a legitimate expression of your liberty. That is infringing on someone else's rights. So there's this kind of, you know, purposeful blindness to certain holes in the way the ideology is applied. So I think, again, it's more an issue of how honestly and transparently you're applying the ideology rather than the fact that it's ideologically driven.
I think that's a really great take on it, because I think often you see ideologies wielded as a weapon, right? Where it's like, well, you know, you clearly care about the environment, so obviously you're going to want to, like, you know, support solar and wind above anything else, right? And you know, my classic example on this note, right, is I think, you know, we should definitely invest in nuclear, right? And you should see a lot of the environmental progressives advocate for some degree of investing in R&D for nuclear, but you don't. You only really see it for solar and wind, right? And it is this incomplete understanding of how the grid works. I don't want to get this whole conversation to climate change and like the intricacies of the electrical grid, but it's a great example of how ideologies are wielded really for political power. And I think that still begs the question, though, is like, well, if ideologies are powerful in the sense that they drum up a lot of support, which translates into money and then translates into more power for the political systems, are ideologies is that like the end state of any political system?
It does seem inevitable in the way that specifically someone running for president can bet that half of the voters are going to go one way or the other. And so this idea of centrism is right now almost kind of a dirty word, because if you're centrist, you're playing to the fascists, or you're playing to the fascists on the other side. Everyone's a fascist, but so it like behooves the politicians to just completely go all in on one side, because they know they'll never get the other side, and that's kind of why it's the perfect opportunity to. I don't think that people want truly a politician who's just going to say whatever it is that they have to say to get this vote. I think that they would like, if they really are honest with themselves, someone who serves the people, and someone who isn't solely trying to just get votes for the sake of getting votes, someone who actually cares about, like Allison was saying, about that balance, about having people on this side that have a say, people on this side that have a say, coming together, compromising. That is obviously what is best for the health of the country.
Yeah, I agree.
And to the point of ideologies becoming the be-all and end-all in the country, I would say that to articulate it best, it would be there's going to always be like extremists, but then the people in the middle are usually the people that get caught up with it, and that they actually end up being drawn to the extremism because they get affected by the counteractions and actions of politicians and things like that.
Yeah, I would add that I think a lot of our ideology-driven politics now, you might say, comes a little bit from our use of technology, maybe an unintended consequence of our quick way of messaging. You start with text messaging, and then you get into Facebook and now Twitter with its limited number of characters. I follow Simon Sinek. I talked about him before, and he, in his book Leaders Eat Last, he talks a lot about how trust is built between humans, and how he knows it's not built in a couple of days, and he knows it doesn't take 7 years or so. But it's not something we can do at all within social media. And so that has only helped to serve this divide, where you can see a tweet, it's something polarizing, it's something that's on the other side. Hey, it's obviously somebody I disagree with. I'm going to lump them into that category. They're this ideologue from this side, and I can go to war with them and never ever have a conversation with that person and understand what they actually believe in.
Yeah, I think trust is a huge factor at play, we're really in an unprecedented time, or literally 50 years ago, it was almost impossible to talk to someone in real time across the country, right? And so it's like there really is that lack of community and that hence lack of trust, which I think makes people kind of on edge a lot. So to kind of wrap things up, I want to kind of end here with, and we could probably keep going on for like another few hours, and I'd love to, but we only scheduled really an hour. So to end, I really want let's take a second to think back to the time before we kind of had that moment of realization that something like unity is needed, right? A movement that can help try and fix or end this political duopoly, and really try and rebuild that core center that can help make this republic, survive not only, but also try and thrive. And so before we kind of came to these ideas, imagine yourself at that time. Imagine going back in time to that individual. What would you tell that person? How would you try and persuade them or talk to them about why something like unity is really important? Let's start with Allison.
All right. So, I remember that I've always had a sense that I cared about politics in the country, because I know my family would always talk about it a lot. And I think I don't feel like I needed too much persuasion once I dove into looking at like both sides and like really hearing both sides of the argument. I just needed that exposure. And I think that's one of my biggest fears about where we're going, is that I think for the most part, people just need to see that a conversation is happening. You don't even need to really try too hard to convince a lot of people. You just need to be open-minded and say, okay, look, we're going to have a conversation. We're going to sit down like rational people and we're going to figure it out. And I think that that's what scares me about how free speech is being shut down, because I'm very one of those people that I think even Nazis should be able to speak on social media, because I think we need to be able to see that and shut it down, right? We need to have it there out in the open so that we know about it and we can shut it down and we can express better arguments, right? And if it's not there, then it happens behind the scenes where we don't need to, where it's, can become even worse. So I just feel like just having that exposure for my younger self is the biggest thing. Just seeing the conversations.
Absolutely. How about Will? What do you think? What would you tell yourself?
Well, I've kind of, since I became politically conscious, I've been highly suspicious of the party establishment. Back in 2016 as a, high schooler, so it didn't really matter what my opinions were. I was, a big Bernie fan, and so very quickly became cynical about the way the DNC operated, of course. And I think what is really important for people to recognize is that, obviously that primary, there was a lot of weird things going on. And then basically the same thing happened again this time around. When you've got, Andrew Yang and Tulsi Gabbard just getting, disappeared in media coverage and just kind of very clearly purposefully kept out of the way. I think that should really be evidence to anyone who cares about the political process that the system we have right now is not something that we can work within, because they did something, 4 years ago that was blatantly corrupt, and then they just did it again without even switching up their tactics. So I mean, I feel like people need to be honest with themselves about how misdirected, how, fundamentally broken in terms of good incentive structure the political duopoly is, and just kind of take the leap of faith that, maybe this time around we aren't going to have a, guaranteed alternative, but you need to start down that path if you want it to happen eventually. You have to admit that the problem is real, and so far there's been very little sign that it can be fixed from within. So it's a matter of acknowledging that it's time to try a different strategy and compete from the outside of the establishment structure, because the avenues from within are just so limited, and I would argue kind of impossible at this point.
I think a lot of us would probably agree, both on the podcast and our listeners. Terri, how about you? What would you say to your former self back?
I would tell me to have a little bit more humility in the fact that you may not know everything, and that you may not as sure as you think you are, and you may not be correct in your opinions. And that I would tell me to really make an effort to engage with other opinions other than mine, whether that's reading a book or speaking to someone. But it's really, really important to, even if you find the opinions completely terrible and just against all of your better judgment, just engage with them, read about them, and take them seriously and see, see if your arguments stack against them. Just really intellectually engage with different thoughts and don't think of the other side as this caricature who's just like a cartoon character dummy that doesn't know anything, because that's never ever what is true, no matter what side you're on. The other side isn't just stupid people.
Yeah. I like what I'm hearing so far, and I want to really make sure we highlight it. We're definitely hearing a little bit about humility, right? There's also this idea of acceptance and openness, right? Where you have to kind of recognize that, look, like the other people on the other political side, they have valid perspectives. Maybe, like Allison said, that they look at the world a little bit differently, but that doesn't mean they're necessarily invalid. It also probably means they're not like these crazy radicals. And also having the humility to recognize that, look, you don't have all the answers. And likely, even if you really care about a topic, there's probably nuance in there, right? You might not necessarily have all the correct ideas. And then I think, to Will's point, understanding that the system, this is also a really scary thought, recognizing that, look, our system might need to change. That's not a small, that's a pretty big thing to say. And I think it's certainly a little scary, right? But it's an important conversation to have, and being able to have those big conversations without being, fearing for your, livelihood or your friends, I think is super important. Let's hear from George and then Toby, and then we'll end it there. George.
Yeah, so I would say two things. I would say, one, don't engage with people who are like bringing other people into your like secular conversation, because you're not debating that person anymore. You're not like talking to that person anymore. You're talking to like a platform, and the same platform that has them frustrated, you frustrated, and everybody else frustrated in the political spectrum. And the second thing would be that I would tell myself, we're 100 days away. Well, now we're 100 days away from the election, and we don't have like exactly everything down, but we have the people, and that's the most important thing. So.
Absolutely. Thanks, George. All right, Toby, last but not least.
Yeah, so I think some of the same things. I think Terri said it really well with humility, because you really, once you think you know everything, that's the moment you've kind of given up on learning anything. And I would have told myself to, I would ask myself some questions. Who do you even know that would call themselves a Democrat or a liberal? Have you ever had a conversation with a person from that side? Are you sure that you would disagree with everything they would possibly bring up? Stop listening to every form of conservative mainstream media, Fox News, Indiana mainstream talk radio, and start looking for other sources of information. I think it was mentioned, like books. Look at the Joe Rogan podcast. He'll have MMA fighters on sometimes, and maybe you're not interested in that, but then he'll have somebody that really touches on some hot topics. It's somebody that really has something to say, and there's a reason it's the most popular podcast in the world, and it's a major source of information now, even well beyond what we call mainstream media. And that's kind of what I would say to myself. Look, you have kids that are going to grow up, and what kind of world do you want them to live in? Do you want to live in a world where we're only fighting the other side because we already know we disagree with them, or do we want to have honest, truthful conversations?
I think that's a great way to end it right there. Toby, Allison, William, or Will, Terri, and George, thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy lives to come together and from all different paths and talk about these really important issues. I definitely want to have you guys on the podcast in future episodes. For our audience, you can find us on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and anywhere podcasts are sold. Also, if you are interested in volunteering or learning more about Articles of Unity, which is really the main organization leading the Unity 2020 movement, you can go to articlesofunity.org. You can also go to Facebook, Twitter, and other places. You'll see them. And we'll have links in the description on YouTube and on our descriptions in our podcast services. So we're going to be producing more content like this. Please send in your feedback, what things you want to see and you don't want to see. And we're really excited to start this journey. And thanks everyone for being here. And yeah, there we go. Thanks.